Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Tonight we're going to continue the second chapter of White Fragility. If you haven't seen the other posts, please look back and take a look. We're up to the 19th page where she hits racism. To understand racism, we first need to distinguish it from mere prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a prejudgment about another person based upon the social groups to which that person belongs. Prejudice consists of thoughts and feelings, including stereotypes, attitudes, and generalizations that are based on little or no experience and then are projected onto everyone from that group. So far, I agree wholeheartedly with that definition of prejudice. Our prejudice tends to be shared because we swim in the same cultural water and absorb the same messages. Now, this is where I disagree. There are people that are prejudiced, and there are people that are not prejudiced. And it really does depend on how much interaction people have with a particular group, or not. Also, the messages they get about that particular group. So if you grew up in a household where there was a lot of prejudice, yes, it's very likely you will have some prejudice because you were taught that. If you grew up in a house where you didn't have a lot of prejudice and people talk to you about the idea that everybody and every individual is different, and that they're not a member of a group where they're monolithic in thought, then you're not going to have as much prejudice, or very little. All humans have prejudice. We cannot avoid it. I don't agree. I think we can avoid prejudice. I think we avoid prejudice by understanding and seeing people in different groups. One of the YouTubers, I actually enjoy his channel. His name is Ramsey Dewey. It's a great YouTube channel. He talks about mixed martial arts. He talks about working out and all the different types of martial arts. And he has an incredible backstory. He's from England originally, born in America, American citizen, now lives in China with his wife. And he has been around the world, Argentina. I mean, this guy has been around, meeting different people, different races, different cultures. And if you heard his channel, he doesn't have a prejudiced bone in his body. He doesn't not have a racist. He doesn't have a prejudice. He has no assertions about people in groups having different attributes. And the reason why that's the case is he's been around the world, seeing all these people, learning about them, and saying, wait a minute, these things aren't true. He's, in terms of like people that project, no prejudice. But I'm not sure he grew up that way. I don't know what his thought process was many years going back. I just know where he's at now, which means we all can get to the point by learning about other people and seeing other people to get out of the idea of prejudice. You could hate somebody from a different minority class, but not hate everybody from that minority class. Meaning you could say, I don't like this individual, but I like these individuals, and they happen to be from the same class, because that is individualized aspect of personality traits, things that you like about them, things you don't like about them. And the same thing applies to your own family. There are people in your family that you like. There are people in your family you don't like. That's just the nature of dealing with people as an individual. But you wouldn't say, my family, we are all this, because my family is not all this. My family is not all that. My family is a mixture of things, because that's how families work. And if you could take that mindset and apply it to everybody else, you're going to get out of prejudice really fast, because you're going to realize that every person's an individual. People who claim not to be prejudiced are demonstrating a profound lack of self-awareness. Wow. Or maybe they recognize that people are not monolithic in groups. But according to Robin DiAngelo, it's not possible, because the only way you could see people is in groups, which is why I call this an evil book, because the only way that she sees people is in groups. Ironically, there are also demonstrating the power of socialization. We have all been taught in schools, through movies, and from family members, teachers, and clergy, that it is important not to be prejudiced. I would hope so. Unfortunately, the prevailing belief that prejudice is bad causes to deny its unavoidable reality. Why? Because if you take a look at what prejudice is, which you just said, is that you believe everybody from a certain group is this. If you don't believe that, you lack prejudice. Now, Robin DiAngelo does not lack prejudice. She wrote an entire book explaining why she doesn't lack prejudice. She's a very prejudiced person herself. She has distinct belief system about groups. I don't. I don't believe those things are true. Therefore, I lack prejudice. Doesn't mean I don't like people or individual people. That's not prejudice. It means I don't judge people by the group that they don't belong to. As I mentioned before, as I said about the NBA. In the NBA, you have athletes that are unbelievable, but that doesn't make every person of color, because the NBA is predominantly African American, every person of color a great basketball player. That's a fallacy. You could say that a group has a great dynamic of something. It doesn't make it every member of the group is going to share that. And that's how all things work. You might be somebody who is very short in a family of very tall people. And you can say, well, all my family members are tall. Yeah, but that doesn't make you tall. And these things happen. So her ideology here in believing that every individual must have prejudice, I don't agree with that premise. And this is where the big issue is. Prejudice is foundational to understanding white fragility. Exactly. Because suggesting that white people have racial prejudice is perceived as saying that we are bad and should be ashamed. And I don't think that a person that does have prejudice necessarily is bad or should be ashamed. I think they're just ignorant. It's the belief that you believe this person is part of this group. As I said, one of my favorite individuals in dealing with this is Daryl Davis. And I did a video showing you about Daryl Davis, if you look back. And Daryl Davis is very non-prejudiced. He's so non-prejudiced that he could do something that most people can't do. Go into a KKK meeting and have conversations with people like that. Now, if you can, and by the way, I absolutely believe that not every KKK member is horrific. I just think it's dangerous to do, especially given the situation. But amazingly, he's been able to do it, and so far, so good. He's fine physically. But the aspect of him being able to do that shows you the level of lack of prejudice he has as an individual. We then feel the need to defend our character rather than explore the inevitable racial prejudice we've absorbed, so we might change them. In this way, our misunderstanding about what prejudice is protects it. And again, this is where I would challenge Robin DiAngelo to explain how is it that people don't do this. There are people that have very close relationships with people from varying different races and very different perspectives and can get along fine with them without saying this about a group. One of the things I don't like is when people group people and say, well, they are just like, because that's prejudice. That's racist. So that ideology is, and the truth is, a lot of people do share it. I'm not denying that there are not people that think that way. What I'm saying is everybody doesn't think that way, unlike what she's saying. Discrimination is action based upon prejudice. This action includes ignoring, exclusion, threats, ridicule, slander, and violence. For example, if hatred is the emotion we feel because of our prejudice, extreme acts of discrimination such as violence may follow. These forms of discrimination are generally clear and recognizable. But if what we feel is more subtle, such as mild discomfort, discrimination is likely to also be subtle or even hard to detect. I think it's so hard to detect that she can't detect it, which is the reason why she doesn't have to prove anything in her book. Most of us can acknowledge that we do feel some unease around certain groups of people. Wow. No, I don't feel unease about certain groups of people. Let me rephrase that. I don't feel unease about any group of people that doesn't want to hurt me. If I feel a group and they are prejudiced against me for whatever reason, then I would feel, I have a trouble here. But other than that, and that's the individual group, not the entire group, right? So in other words, let's suppose there's a group of people. Let's suppose Pakistanis, a group of Pakistanis in a room, and for whatever reason I pissed them off and they were angry at me and I'm getting like, oh, I better get out of here, it doesn't mean that I would think that every Pakistani is going to meet me and hate me. So no, I wouldn't attribute that to every Pakistani just because it happened in a room full of Pakistanis for whatever reason. By the way, that's never happened. But the idea here is that she again asserts an ideology with no proof, no backing, no nothing. I love this. Most of us can acknowledge that we do feel some unease around certain groups of people, if only a heightened sense of self-consciousness. Now, this is an interesting one. And this is one that's unfair. To say you don't want to be rude or hurt a group, that you are self-conscious in the idea that you may say something or do something that could be perceived as a negative because you're not familiar with the group, doesn't make you prejudiced against that group. It just makes you unfamiliar or unaware of the customs. I think that was in one of the trainers on here that I was looking at when I was doing my research. One of the trainers was going to put her hand out to shake one of the man's hands. She goes, oh, I forgot. You don't shake hands. It's your culture that you don't do that. And she then talked about that. Now, there was an uneasiness. Because she violated by doing the action. And she's like, man, it's so much better. I was about to hug you. Like, the idea was that was something she was comfortable with, but without recognizing it may be uncomfortable for him. So the nature, by you being uncomfortable because you don't know something, and saying, well, I don't know how this group interacts, but I'm going to try it anyway, and I'm going to do my best to learn and to grow, that doesn't make you prejudiced in any way, shape, or form. It makes you having to learn. The same way that when you were young, you called the cat the dog, or the dog the cat, because it was a four-legged creature and you put it in the wrong category. If the dog or cat felt bad about that, your mother would go, shh, don't do that to the dog or cat, you're going to hurt its feelings. But this feeling doesn't come naturally, or unease comes from living separate from a group of people while simultaneously absorbing incomplete or erroneous information about them. When the prejudice causes me to act differently, I am less relaxed around you, or I avoid interacting with you. Now again, I disagree. I think you could be uneasy and push yourself to do an interaction to get used to it. We see this with people that go to AA all the time. A person that walks into the room, they're uneasy. What are the group rules? I don't know. How does this stuff work here? I don't know if I'm going to get comfortable. And they're uneasy about the group. It's not because they're prejudiced against people in AA. They're suffering from generally an addiction that's getting them there the same way. But they're unused to it. What's the rules? I don't know how this stuff works here. But she is utilizing that normal emotion as, now you're prejudiced. No, that's a misdefinition. And if I'm now avoiding or interacting with you, I'm now discriminating. Prejudice always manifests itself in action, because the way I see the world drives my actions in the world. Everyone has prejudice and everyone discriminates. Again, don't agree with either statement. Given this reality, inserting the qualifier reverse is nonsensical. When a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it has transformed its racism, a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-image of individual actors. Now, before I get to the next sentence, she's now given you a new definition of racism. Now, why do I say new? Well, let's take a look at the Merriam-Webster Dictionary of Racism. This comes from, again, Merriam-Webster, definition of racism, a belief, not an action, by the way, which she tries to go ahead and redefine, a belief that a race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and the racial difference produced an inherent superiority of a particular race. In other words, if I believe that I'm part of this race or that race, or I believe this race is better than that race inherently because of their genetics, therefore that's racism. B, the second definition, a doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles. A political or social system founded on racism, which of course is not a great definition because it uses racism in the definition. And of course, racial prejudice or discrimination. Now, that's the current definition of racism. Now, why do you think Robin DiAngelo is trying to, and again, she's a women's studies teacher, right? White studies teacher. Why in the world is she redefining something? Did she become an English professor and starting to do linguistics? And it's very simple. The reason why is because when you're trying to change a narrative, it's hard because people are going to say, wait a minute, this fits that definition. So now you have to change the definition. And when you try to change the definition, you're trying to change the core of things. I'm going to mix this name up because it's a hard name to pronounce because I'm not familiar with the name, not because I'm prejudiced. J. Kahawalani Kuhuani, professor of American Studies and Anthropology at the Wesleyan University, explains, racism is structure, not an event. Wow. A professor of anthropological and American studies said this, so it must be true. Forget the dictionary. We don't need to. We have a professor that said it. I love this, by the way. This is called a fallacy from authority. That you assert somebody who has an authority of something, and you go, they said it, so it must be so. But that's not its definition. That's never been its definition. You're recreating it again for an agenda. Now you'll say, how do I know that Miss Kowani has a agenda? Well, I'm going to show you who she is in a minute, and you'll tell me if you think she may have an agenda. But I'm just going to get to her point first. American women struggle for suffrage illustrates how institutional power transforms prejudice and discrimination into structures of oppression. Everyone has prejudice and discriminates, but structures of oppression go well beyond individuals. While women could be prejudiced and discriminate against men in individual interactions, women as a group could not deny men their civil rights. I don't agree with that either. And the nature of what the power structure that takes place in relationships has been complex for generations and millennia. This idea that somehow only women have been subjugated, again, is not a known entity. There's a lot of debate about this, and there's a lot of that myth of when we make the myth that everything now is the same way it was before, and that everybody looked at it the same way, and that's not true. That myth, that fallacy, is in this type of thinking, where everything is like you believe that this is how all women thought, and this is how. And as I showed you in the thing about women's suffrage, that it was not the case. Women did not believe that at all, not in totality. It was a small group of women that believed it, and they drug everybody with them. Well, small relative to the population, and they became vocal and became that. But the anti-suffrage movement, which, by the way, so many people never even knew existed because they don't study history, and again, they make no mention of them in the book because they have an agenda and pushing only one ideology. But men as a group could and did deny women their civil rights. Men as a group have denied men their civil rights. Throughout history and the ages, there have been people that have been denied their civil rights by the people, excuse me, the people in power. People in power have taken away people's rights and not given rights for a long time. Men have been discriminated against the same way. By the way, there's a guy named Karl Marx who writes all about this. And he writes about it from the version of men who've been discriminated against and held down and not given their rights. You always can be the victim if you'd like to. Men can do so because they control all the institutions. The fact that men were the predominant force of the control does not mean that men had control. Those are two different statements. Let me try to help this a little bit in terms of this. There is a principal of a school. The principal sets the rules. If the principal is male and is setting the rules for that school, that does not mean that all the men in that school have power like the principal. So the nature of saying you're a man, therefore you have power, is irrelevant. It happens to be a man in power, but how many men actually had power? Or how many men had no power? Therefore, only women could gain suffrage was for men to grant it to them. Women could not grant suffrage to themselves, and again, I showed you that was not true. It was women who actually pushed it, and If they would have had more women on board right away and more women felt that way, they would have gotten it much earlier. Similarly, racism, like sexism, and other forms of oppression, occurs when a racial group's prejudice is backed by legal authority and institutional control. This authority and control transforms individual prejudice into a far-reaching system that no longer depends on the good intentions of individual actors. It becomes the default of society, and it reproduces automatically. Racism is a system. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that intersections of race and gender is an example of suffrage. White men granted suffrage to women, but only granted full access to white women. Women of color were denied full access until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I've debunked that because it's also not true. But getting back now to the professor, to show you the ideology that Robin DiAngelo is quoting. And I really you could search her up yourself and learn a little bit more about her. Her ratings were pretty high in terms of Rate My Professor, except for the rating that's stated by one of the guys, stated that if you're a white man, this is going to be a tough course for you, and gave her a low grade. What the idea is, and I understand that the guy seemed to denote from his low grade and the way that he wrote his comment, it sounded like he felt discriminated against based upon that. And given her stance, what you're about to see, I could actually see why that's very possible. So, but you can make up your own mind.
I kind of think about marriage in relation to settler colonialism and also indigeneity category of analysis and indigenous peoples in my own kind of perspective looking at settler colonialism in Hawaii. There's been work that's been done on kinship systems in the continent in terms of indigenous peoples and how governments, whether it's early Spain, eventually Mexico, what became the U.S., what became Canada, really imposing different colonial norms on indigenous peoples and attacking kinship distinctions and different kinds of diversity, and that included different norms around gender and sexuality. What's wrong with marriage being the defining issue? Well, I'll speak to that as someone who's completely opposed to marriage as a goal, and for me it all goes back to property. And it does go back to settler colonialism. And I mean, I think about British common law and its import in North America. I think about the missionaries who went to Hawaii from Connecticut and Massachusetts and imposed heterosexual marriage as a norm, and interfaced with what was then a new Hawaiian kingdom that was founded in 1810. The missionaries got there in 1820 and proceeded to try and eradicate indigenous practices of polyandry, polygamy, same-sex sexuality. They also, of course, found sibling, chiefly incestuous relationships in the name of producing high-ranking offspring repugnant, so they attacked that as well. And I see marriage bound up with trying to forcibly subordinate Hawaiian women and issues of sexual autonomy for all people, but especially Hawaiian women, in relation to missionaries trying to teach a subservience to men in the name of marriage and what was seen as the more civilized way to be.
So, there you go. I am against marriage. I have no issue with incest. Because incest is not an issue, according to this, because it's a colonialization. It's a pushing on to them about the beliefs of society that she doesn't agree with. Now, I don't think that the majority of Americans would agree with her. Now, of course, she'll say that's because you've been indoctrinated by the colonialization ideology, because the idea of people sleeping with their sibling is absolutely normal and healthy and should be happening. And the idea of marriage, which is just a colonial invention. Colonial invention, marriage. I guess I didn't realize that the Bible, which talks about marriage, was way before there was anything called colonialization or a concept of that. And the idea of one man marrying a woman, you'll never find that in the first chapter of the first book. No, it won't be there. Because it's a colonial invention that just knew that nobody ever had this idea until the Americans, or actually it wouldn't be Americans at that point, it would be English and Spain, and they were spreading their colonialized ideas and stopping things such as incest. And when England came to India, there was a practice, and I remember learning this in philosophy class many years ago, and there was a big argument. What do you do when you come across a culture, but their practices violate some major rule? And in India, there was a practice that when a husband died, they would take the wife alive and burn her with the dead husband together. And the English saw this and put an end to that practice and said this is absolutely, they couldn't allow that to happen. Now, the argument in philosophy class was this correct or not? And, going back and forth. And again, an argument about it, meaning there's two sides to this in terms of understanding this. And this goes back to objective morality or subjective morality. Because if you believe in subjective morality, then what gives you the right to go over theirs? If you believe in objective reality, then you have a right to. So it really goes back to that type of argument. But the nature of that was that, wait, what do you do here? What's the right thing? Should we allow people to take their wives, the widowed woman, to be burnt alive with the husband? So the nature here is the people who colonizing saw incest and said, wait a minute, we're stopping this. We're seeing these sexual practices they didn't agree with and said, we're stopping this. And to say that these were colonial ideas is actually wrong. They're actually religious ideas imposed from a religious perspective. Now, you want to argue with them and say that shouldn't be the case, and you can make an argument why you disagree. But she's quoting it as it's a colonial ideology, as opposed to a religious one. Now, this is why this is important, because Robin DiAngelo is quoting these people. Tashinishi quotes, and the professor Kayawani, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing, and it's like, well, these are the norms that we should all just aspire to. Remember, New York Times bestseller. I want to understand and really understand how people read this and not go, whoa, what are we saying here? What are we doing here? The system of racism begins with ideology, which refers to the big ideas that are reinforced throughout society. From birth, we are conditioned to accepting and not questioning these ideas. Ideology is reinforced across society. Now, it is true that we get indoctrinated to begin with, but we do question, and we do say, no, and I don't agree with this. If you don't believe me, look at your Thanksgiving dinner table, I'm using it as an example, and see how many times people argue with each other, disagree with each other, mothers and fathers that disagree with each other. So I don't believe this idea. You never question. All these good kids that are sitting around, never questioning their parents and just listen. Yes, mommy and daddy. I don't believe that she's saying something is true. For example, in schools and textbooks, political speeches, movies, advertising, holiday celebration, and the words and phrases, the ideas are also reinforced through social penalties when someone questions an ideology and through the limited availability of alternative ideas. Ideologies are the framework that which we have taught to represent, interpret, and understand and make sense of social existence. Because these ideas are constantly reinforced, they're very hard to avoid believing and internalizing. Example of ideology in the United States includes individualism, the superiority of capitalism as an economic system, and democracy as a political system. Consumerism as a desirable lifestyle, and mediocrity. Anyone can succeed, or if he or she works hard. Yes, I agree with all of those things. And let's take the opposite. Now, let's take what she's saying here, because this is like really important to understanding how insane this is. What she wants to say is individualism was important, collectivism was important. You don't matter. What your group you come from matters. That's more important. Second, superiority of capitalism. Capitalism was what's best. Socialism, communism, they work so much better. Again, if you don't understand history and you learn nothing from it, you can make that case an argument. If you ever studied it, it's insane. There is a reason why most people, and by the way, if you look this up, immigration, What country is the number one country people from other countries run to? Is it a socialist country? Is it a communist regime? Is it Korea or North Korea? Is it China or Japan? No, it's the United States of America. Why is that? Why do people want to come here for? Because even our poorest of people live better than most people in other countries. And that's just a statement of fact based upon, again, materialistic measures. From the aspect of seeing money or wealth or things that you have. Now, I don't believe money buys you happiness. I don't. But lack of it can cause you a lot of problems and misery. Democracy. No, we've got to get rid of that. The irony here is that we don't want people to be able to have any say in their own government. They shouldn't be able to do that. That's not good. And by the way, she doesn't even know what government we have because we don't have a democracy. We have a representative republic. That's got nothing to do with democracy. A democracy is the idea that everybody gets to vote, which means that if we get together and say, you know something? We don't like Robin DiAngelo. Let's vote. And let's vote her off the island in a sense. If we lived in a democracy, I'd be able to do such a thing. But no, we believe in a representative republic and that there are certain unalienable rights that even the government is not supposed to touch. And that this freedom supersedes even the greatest democracy of mobs. And that is one of the strengths of our system that she does not seem to understand. Consumerism as a desirable lifestyle. Yes, people should have much less in their life. Okay? I think people should have freedom to choose what they have in their life. I don't think anybody should be able to say, you know something? You have too much stuff. We're taking some away from you. That is problematic. That leads to theft. It leads to the idea that I think I'm entitled to your things. So all the things she says in here right now should tell you about the sickness of her thought process. But again, New York Times bestseller. The racial ideology that circulates in the United States rationalizes racial hierarchies as the outcome of a natural order resulting from either genetics or individual effort or talent. Those who don't succeed are just not as naturally capable, deserving, or hardworking. Wow. I just want to say, according to her logic, I should get Michael Jordan's money from the NBA because I'm just as talented and capable as Michael Jordan was. Me and him are absolutely interchangeable. I can play basketball as well as he did. I am that good. Why? Because to think that anybody could be genetically or individually have a talent? Get the hell out of here. Nobody's got any talent. Well, if you watch America's Got Talent, you might think that at this point. But the fact is that the nature is that we all have individual talents. And they're not interchangeable. We're not the same. What I'm good at and what you're good at are different things. You're better at certain things than me. I'm better at certain things than you. That's the nature of life. And that's actually what makes life worth living. Could you imagine for a minute you come home to your wife and go, honey, the truth of the matter is I'm just interchanging you with somebody else because you're just as good or as anybody else. It doesn't make a difference who you are. Your talents and individuality means nothing. Anybody can fill your role. Would you believe that? You know, son, we're getting rid of you. We're trading you for 2 players to be named later. Because that's what she's saying. Because either genetics or individual effort or talent. And yes, if you saw The Last Dance, if you understand about Michael Jordan, if you understand what he did in his career, you understand the effort that he put forth. And that made him great. It is what exceptionalism comes from. But again, you could write a book today and not do much in it and still become a New York Times bestseller. Those who don't succeed are just not naturally as capable, deserving, or hardworking. Ideologies that obscure racism as a system of inequality are perhaps the most powerful racial forces because once we accept our position within racial hierarchy, these positions seem natural and difficult to question even when we are disadvantaged by them. In this way, very little external pressure needs to be applied to keep people in their place. Once this rationalization for inequality are internalized, both sides will uphold the relationship. No. If I bring you crap and say, here, want to buy this, or if somebody brings you apples and says, here, you want to buy this, are those things equal? Here, here, it smells, it's horrible, here, take it. Do you think that's equal to the apples being brought? And what she's basically trying to say is, it doesn't matter what you do, it's equal. It's not. What you bring to the table matters. Your work ethic matters. What you do in terms of your development matters. So this idea that everybody gets a trophy because you're all the same is a sickness. That's not healthy. If I work very hard and I do a good job, people will come to me and say, you know something? You help this person, you help this person. Please help me. If everybody that came to me didn't get any help, I'd be out of business real fast. I'd be like, bye, what do I need you for? You didn't help this person, you didn't help this person, you didn't help nobody. Then what's the purpose? Racism is deeply embedded in the fabric of our society. It's not limited to a single act or person, nor does it move back and forth from one day benefiting whites into another day, or even the era benefiting people of color. The direction of power between white people and people of color in historic, traditional, and normalized in ideology. Racism differs from individual racial prejudice and racial discrimination in the historical accumulation of ongoing use of institutional power and authority to support the prejudice and to systematically enforce discriminatory behaviors within far-reaching efforts. Well, if that's the truth, then the United States is really bad at this. People from Nigeria that immigrate into the society, that come from Nigeria, actually do better than the general population. Now I'm confused. They're African, not African American, African, coming to America as immigrants, and on average do better than the general population. If the population was designed to become racist against them, why they do better? Same thing's true of Asians. Now again, I don't know that category and which ones are and aren't in that, but in the stats that I was reading, they actually do better than whites as well. So I'm a little confused. If the system is designed for white people to be superior, then they did a horrible job of keeping themselves superior. People of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against white people, but they lack the social institutional power that transforms the prejudice and discrimination into racism. And again, that's by her made-up definition, not by the definition or a definition. Because by no definition, and that's the reason why there's a fight to try to change the definition. So they can say, oh, this is true, look, you have no power, you can't be racist. No, but then prejudice and discrimination would be the bad thing and racism wouldn't. But let's not even go there right now. The impact of their prejudice on whiteness is temporary and contextual. Whites hold the social institutional positions in society to infuse their racial prejudice into laws, policies, and practice and norms of society in the way that people of color do not. Now, if we can get to those laws, policies, practices in society, I would love to hear it. Like, if you could say this is a law and a practice and something in society, then I'd love to change it. And by the way, there are things in law, in the society, of things I'd love to change that would create more equality in the system. Lawyers and the way that we tribute lawyers to people, and the fact that we make people pay for attorneys, and that if you have more money, you get better attorneys. And it's sort of like therapists. The better the therapist, the less insurance you take. Okay, that's the statement of fact. Very good therapists do not take insurance. Okay, insurance is a lot of paperwork with very little value coming back. People are starting out with therapists that don't have a background or don't have standing. They have to take insurance in the beginning because they need to, and then they have to do a lot of paperwork and all that, and then they get to the point where they're good enough and they don't take insurance either. And that's the nature, because insurance makes the people who are generally newer or maybe not as seasoned, and basically those are the people that take insurance. Same thing with attorneys. When you're paying for an attorney, the higher they're making, generally the better they are. So if you don't come from a place that has money, if you don't have money in your family, you are going to be at a huge disadvantage going into court. And that's just a statement of fact. Now, that leads to inequality. So that needs to be looked at. And there's a lot of factors about looking at those things and saying, well, how can we make those things better? That's got nothing to do with what she's talking about. People of color may also, okay. Many whites see racism as a thing of the past. And of course, we are well served not to acknowledge it in the present. When most people see racism in the past, they're talking about things like lynching and cross-burning and hiring discrimination aspects or redlining laws which were around. There's a lot of factors and laws that have been changed that used to be law that held, the segregation in sinks, that, from water fountains. There's a lot of law that has been racist, no question. We've broken down those laws. And if she could state more laws that we have to get rid of, love to hear that also as well. Yet racial disparity between whites and people of color continue to exist in every institution across society. In many cases, it is increasing rather than decreasing. There's a very famous thing about, I think it's Denmark, where they have one of the most egalitarian systems. Yet they're seeing a greater increase in disparity between men and women based upon choices they make. And now social scientists are looking at this going, wow, we would assume that it's egalitarian, people doing the same thing. They should all be doing similar things, but they don't choose similar things. So the more freedom you give people, the more they're going to choose differences. So the question is that what's going on? Or are there certain things that are racially going on? But that needs to be looked at and studied, not just asserted. You just don't make an assertion. Oh, disparity must be. The first thing you learn in something called science, and I know she doesn't believe in science, is correlation does not imply causation. So if two things are correlated to each other, it doesn't mean one caused the other. Although segregation may make the disparities difficult for whites to see and easy to deny, racial disparities and their effects on overall quality of life have been extensively documented by a wide range of agencies. Among these documenting these agencies are the U.S. Census Bureau, the United Nations academic groups such as the UCLA Civil Rights Project and the Metropolis Project, and nonprofits such as the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League. Again, I absolutely agree. All those things are true. It doesn't tell you anything. Scholar Marlon Fry uses the metaphor of a birdcage to describe the interlocking forces of oppression. If you stand close to a birdcage and press your face against the wires, your perception of the bars will disappear, and you'll have almost an unobstructed view of the bird. If you turn your head to examine one wire of the cage closely, you will not be able to see the other wires. If you understand that the cage is based on the myopic view, you may not understand why a bird doesn't just go around the single wire and fly away. You might even assume the bird likes the cage, or chose its place in the cage. But if you step back and took a wider view, you'd begin to see that the wires will come together in an interlocking pattern, a pattern that works to hold the bird firmly in place. It now becomes clear that a network of systematically related barriers surround the bird. Taken individually, none of these barriers would be difficult for the bird to get around, but because they interlock with each other, they'll thoroughly restrict the bird. While some birds may escape from the cage, most will not, and certainly that those that do escape will have to navigate many barriers that bird outside the cage do not. Now, again, this implies that African Americans are all stuck in a cage and can't get out. But if you take a look at the largest growing middle class in the United States, it's African Americans. Now, you could say, well, few are escaping. It's not a few. It's a huge population. And I will tell you that I've had many clients throughout the years, the ones that have listened, that have done certain things, have gotten better and actually been able to raise their quality of life and standard of living. Too many times they don't. I have too many people that I've worked with that don't follow through. They don't do what they could do to make their life and their economic situations better. Why that happens is a great question, and that great sociologists should work on. Okay, I could talk about it from an individual level, but if you want to understand it from a sociological perspective, that's a great study. But again, it's just presuming things. The birdcage metaphor helps us understand why racism can be so hard to see and recognize. We have a limited view. Without recognizing how our position in relation to the bird defies how much of a cage we can see, we rely on single situations, exceptions, and anecdotal evidence for understanding, rather than a broader interlocking patterns. Although there are always exceptions, the patterns are consistent and well documented. People of color are confined and shaped by forces and barriers that are not accidental, occasional, or unavoidable. These forces are systematically related to each other in ways that are restricting their movement. Individual whites may be against racism, but they will still benefit from a system that privileges whites as a group. David Wellerman succinctly summarized racism as a system of advantage based on race. These advantages are referred to as white privilege, a sociological concept referring to advantages that are taken for granted by whites that cannot be similarly enjoyed by people of color in the same context. Government, community, workplace, school. But let me be clear. Stating that racism privileges whites does not mean that individual white people do not struggle or face barriers. It does not mean that we do not face the particular barriers of racism. As with prejudice and discrimination, we can remove the qualifier reverse from any discrimination of race. By definition, racism is a deeply embedded historical system of institutional power. It's not fluid and does not change direction simply because a few individuals of color manage to excel. Now, again, stating that a few individuals of color excel is a horrible underrepresentation of reality, and not to take a look at the gains and understanding of that. We also need to look about why things have happened, and there are reasons for it. But when you take a simplistic ideology and you put in your own narrative, you can make anything you like make sense. Now, I hope we're going to stop at this point. It's page 24 of White Fragility. It's the second chapter in the book. The next one is going to be whiteness as a proposition of status. I can't wait. I hope that you like this video. I hope that you'll share it. I hope that you'll subscribe if you have not. And of course, that you'll be continuing on this journey of this insanity. And I hope that we're not at the point where everybody's willing to just say, we don't care anymore about our society, that the people that are here just inherently are just racist people, and that the system has to be torn down. And to understand that, to say the system has to be torn down, it means that everything that you are and that you built has to be torn down. And I think that idea is a little irrational and based upon an emotional argument, not based upon facts. Again, have a good night and good mental health.